complex needs. Oh, we're being recorded. We have to say we don't mind. So I have a professional and personal background in the world of special education, and I'm currently studying for a doctorate in identity and belonging for people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. But obviously I'm appearing on the Autistic Girls Network because one of the reasons that I'm able to be so successful in my professional life is that I have a brain that's capable of very intense focus. It's very interested in one topic and it's happy to learn a lot about that topic. And happily for me, that translates into my professional life. And since running the sensory projects, which I've been running for just over 10 years now, I've been able to create a working life for myself that matches with my neurotype and my needs and abilities within that spectrum. So it's certainly less challenging than working within a school. And a few years ago, just like not too long ago, about 4 years ago, my son became the UK's youngest published author with his book My Mummy is Autistic. And up until this book was published, I wasn't out professionally as autistic. It wasn't something that I spoke about much. Sometimes I would tell people, but I generally used to keep it under my hat because I was aware of the prejudice that is out there, and the, if somebody's booking me to do a training day for their school or to speak at a conference. On Friday, I will be speaking at the National Education Conference as one of their keynote seminar speakers. They might think, oh, she's autistic, she's going to be difficult to deal with and things like that. And this is my job. And so I didn't want to be facing that sort of prejudice professionally. But then when your son becomes the UK's youngest published author, you become the UK's most obnoxiously proud mother. And you have to tell everybody, he wrote a book. He wrote a book and it's brilliant. And Chris Packham has written the foreword and it's just so exciting. And so you can't not be out. And people were on at me and they were saying, you should really write a book too, Jo. A lot of stuff about being autistic. You are autistic. You should write a book, Jo. And I would always say, no. For starters, writing a book, and I have 7 or 8 books published now on things to do with sensory engagement and people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. There's a process to writing a book. And first of all, the sort of start part of it is you have to have the whole book in your head all in one go in order to know which bit goes where. And once you've got it all in your head and you know which bit goes where, then you can go, okay, I'm going to write this bit now, I'm going to write this bit now, and chalk it off. But that process of getting it all in your head requires a lot of focus and a lot of mental energy, and I do have that. But I also have this need to, if I write a book about something, I want to be as informed about it as I can be. And in my professional role, working with people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities, people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, they are a very minority population. They are very marginalized in terms of research. And so there's not a lot of research out there about them. And so I can almost read all of it. I can't actually read all of it, but I can certainly feel like I've read everything. Whereas if you go around and try and read the research about autism, you'll be really struggling. You'd need several lifetimes to read all of it. And so I didn't want to do the research reading, and I didn't want to hold all this book in my head. And I just kept saying to people, I haven't got the time because I've got to catch a train on Thursday because I'm doing a conference on Friday and I'm running a training on Wednesday. So I just haven't got the time to hold it all in my head. And then you know what happened. Lockdown happened. And they were on the radio going, oh, what are you going to do with your lockdown? Are you going to write a book? And you're like, oh, I've got no excuse now. And so the Subtle Spectrum, which is my book, was born out of lockdown. But what that time enabled me to do was certainly not to read all the research, but I read an enormous amount of research that's to do with the parts of the spectrum that I occupy. And I wanted to know really practical things. Like I wanted to know what's the genetics about autism and what are the brain differences and things like that. And the last time I was here, I was talking about being an autistic teenage girl. And what we found afterwards were the bit of that presentation that generated the most questions was the parts of it where I talked about emotional processing and feelings. And so I was thinking that this time I would chat to you about, we called it feeling autistic, didn't we? Like it's, oh, I feel a bit autistic today. But it was that to do with the emotions and feelings. And as I was starting to think about what to talk to you about, there's a public lecture by Dr. Caroline Robertson, and it's on CNN and it's available on YouTube, and it's to do with the neuroscience around autism. And it's one of the most lovely pieces of research reporting that I encountered as I was doing the research reading for the subtle spectrum. And my husband was teasing me as I was writing this and saying, you know, a quarter of that book, Jo, is just going to be the bibliography. People aren't that interested in the geek stuff, but I've condensed it. It's just like I took all that research and then just put it on one page in there. So it's like little bite-sized bits. But in this public lecture, Dr. Robertson is talking about the neurodifferences. This, you know, we hear the term neurodivergence and neurodiversity. Neurodivergence indicates a brain wired differently. There's a difference in your neurology, your neurotype is different. And they would she was doing an overview of all the research that's been done and trying to identify what this difference is. And she draws a really beautiful conclusion, and I will just botch a version of it. So do go and look up the proper presentation. But what she said is, when we look at the neuroscience to do with non-autistic brains, to do with neurotypical brains, we find things in patterns. Like we find that the connections are like this, and that the response to this is like this, and they're broadly similar. And when we look at autistic brains in comparison to neurotypical brains, we find that they are different. So they're different from the neurotypical brains. You can see that this is a different brain. But when we look at autistic brains in relation to autistic brains, they're also different. So like neurotypical brains are sort of broadly similar, and autistic brains are uniquely unique. Like they're definitely different from the neurotypical brains, but they're also really different from each other. And so it's very difficult to make generalizations. And it's why it's so obvious that it's a spectrum, because there are all these different experiences within it. And although there are different experiences within being neurotypical, there's more of a pattern there than there is within the autistic world. And so that idea of us having sort of uniquely unique brains was something that I was thinking overlaps with your emotional processing, and your emotions are processed in your brain. So it would make sense that if you have these very unusual brains, that you would have different ways of processing emotions, and that those different ways would be both different from the neurotypical sort of presumed norm and different from each other as well. So we might get insight from one autistic person that resonates with the autistic person that we know, or we might not. And so I was going to look at what these differences might be, but I wanted to do a little detour before I did, just to say how shocked I was by the research that I read into autistic experience. And I am a massive research geek. All the work that I do at the Sensory Projects is underpinned by research where I can find it, you know, because there's not as much research about the population of people I work on behalf of. And if you come and find me on Twitter, you'll see that my Twitter feed is little chunks of the research that I read. And if you stay following me on Twitter, you'll see me on a train tomorrow. I'll be 8 hours on a train tomorrow. I was 10 hours on a train last week, and I'm reading the research and just sharing little bits of it. And so I'm really used to research being like a good solid thing, something that you point to, something you go, this was evidence-based, this is good practice because it's been tested, and it's not just somebody selling it to you, it's not just advertising, there's a foundation here. And then you read the autistic research and you go, oh my goodness, it's so... I'll give you the example I gave you last time. I read a study that was about the experiences of autistic people at transition, so going from like 16 to 24, what's your experience of changing from a teenager into an adult? And they'd studied a huge load of people, and it was a really reputable study. It was respectable institutions, a collaboration between loads of institutions. It qualifies as good research. It's published in a top level journal. It's been peer reviewed. It's in terms of how you evaluate research, it's great research. And they found all sorts of things. They found that autistic people are more likely to have mental health problems. Autistic people are more likely to have had contact with the police. Autistic people are less likely to be in all these grim things, you know, and I don't suppose you would be surprised by any of them. You know, the autistic people fared worse than non-autistic people as they transitioned from teenage years to adulthood. In the conclusion of that paper, they wrote, "This shows that being autistic causes a poor quality of life." And you could have written that same paper about the experiences of gay adolescents or black adolescents, you know, and you would have found more contact with the police, more likely to be diagnosed with a mental health problem, and you would never have found it written and published and peer-reviewed that being black causes poor quality of life. So even within good quality research, there is an extraordinary bias against us. And when I was looking at the research around our emotional processing, you see the same sorts of things. So I saw one study where the researchers were commenting that the autistic children didn't want comfort from their parents. And this was the weirdness of our emotional lives, because we didn't want to be comforted by our parents when we were upset. And I was waiting as I read that for like the next part of that thought, which is presumably that the comfort that they were being offered is the comfort that they as a neurotypical person would have wanted. So maybe a cuddle or somebody to talk to about it. And, you know, maybe the autistic person did want comfort from their parents, but they just wanted it in a form of comfort that they find comforting, not a form of comfort that the researcher had deemed as comforting. Or they said the autistic children, they did another one where the people in the study had to do like a challenging thing, and then they recorded how well they coped with the challenge. And the autistic children were heard to condemn themselves too much as they did this challenge. So they would say things out loud about them not being very good at this or them not managing very well. And the researchers said, you know, these autistic people are really down on themselves, and they speak really badly about themselves. And you think like, yeah, and where did they learn that? Because I don't think that that's a part of autism. I imagine that little child has grown up in a world where people have said, you know, you're not doing it right, and you didn't do it very well, and they've heard that, and they're repeating a bias. It's not some failure in our emotional processing. Oh, there was another one. This is the annoying thing. There were so many of them that were really upsettingly like that. You can read them and you can find out useful stuff, but then it's all framed in this pathology. So they were saying the autistic children asked for help, but they didn't do it effectively. The adults didn't help them when the autistic children asked for help, but when the non-autistic children asked for help, the adults helped them. And so, you know, these autistic children are not emotionally good or something. And you think, well, no, the problem there, why didn't the adult help when the autistic child asked for help? What was deemed so ineffective that a grown-up watching a child ask for help didn't respond? And then I can kind of answer that question from other stuff that I've read and from experiences that I've had. And what it will be is the emotional effect in that child's voice as they asked. So the neurotypical child will have asked in a way that sounded like an emotional need, whereas the autistic child might have asked in a really sort of plain speaking, you know, no emotional intonation in their voice. And so the adults listening, who would have been adults in the classroom around those children, kind of believe the non-autistic child and don't believe the autistic child. And so the autistic child's experience of asking for help is of not being believed, that you need help. And then it just builds and builds and cycles, and it's depressing. And so they all write this stuff, and then they conclude that we are defective in some way. And that just through my emotional landscape being different to a non-autistic person's emotional landscape, that it's automatically wrong, and just because my emotional expression is different to somebody else's emotional expression, I'm not expressing my emotions correctly. Or because the way I like to be comforted is different from the way, comfort is supposed to be given, that means I don't want comfort. It's an amazing conclusion to draw. And you see it in, so some of the other research that I looked at for the subtle spectrum was our health differences. And you read scary things like autistic children are half as likely to receive pain medication when in pain than non-autistic children. And that's because the way that we express pain might look different. And so it doesn't look like we're in pain, or we didn't report our pain in a way that was believed. And so our experience is of trying to make these communications and then them being deemed not good enough, or them not being effective and not being believed. And it builds and builds. So I should put down my bugbear about the research, but you have to be aware that, like, the big autism organizations have to run off the back of this research, because they have to show that they are being informed by research. And I am definitely not somebody who would ever tell you not to look at research, but you have to be aware of that bias within it. And then there is another bias against autistic people when it comes to research and emotional well-being, in that we have in the past sort of decade, 2 decades, come on light years in our understanding of emotional well-being in the general population and our awareness of mental health. And that's only really been boosted by the pandemic, as lots of people experience mental ill health. And so you have like public health messages that say it's really important to pick up the phone and talk to your friend. And that's a lovely, really good message for a neurotypical brain. Like, imagine, I don't know the autistic people in your life, but imagine when they were stressed, just sort of saying to them, oh, just pick up the phone and have a conversation with somebody. I can't think, on a good day, that would be really stressful for me. It's definitely not how to help me when I'm having a bad day. And the advice that gets given around mental health is based on neurotypical people. And the research that is done about mental health, it's not only done on neurotypical people, it actively excludes autistic people. So we're not even represented there on the periphery of it as like this little margin group who didn't, respond to the treatment in the same way. When they choose their sample sizes, when they go, okay, we're going to test this mental health strategy on 50 people, if there are any autistic people within those 50, they are removed so that they don't skew the results. So we don't have the research basis to inform our mental health care, and we are beginning to know things. So like the research into mindfulness is spectacular. Mindfulness is a gorgeous treatment for mental health. It's a really, really superb answer to anxiety. Loads of autistic people experience anxiety, but loads of autistic people also experience trauma, and mindfulness can be dangerous to people who've experienced trauma. And so if you go to the doctor and say, if somebody's worried about you and because you're anxious all the time, and then you get to the doctor or you get to somebody who gives good mental health advice and they say, oh, you're anxious. Okay, let's try practicing for mindfulness. In a general world, that's good advice. But if you are somebody who's experienced trauma, that's really dangerous, because what mindfulness does is put you in your present moment. And if you've experienced trauma, all the scary bad things from your past are in your present moment. And so being asked to be mindful is being asked to occupy us. It's re-traumatizing. And so it's not good advice. So the general public, good advice is not necessarily good advice for us. And then the main one that everybody knows is, oh, just talk about it. Autism is a social communication difference. So just talk about it hits both of those. It's social, you need to talk to somebody, and it's communication. So it's already quite challenging. And then you don't necessarily have the physiological ability in your brain to do it. So there's a condition called Elixirthemia, which is something I mentioned last time, which is a condition that affects your ability to retrieve emotional words from the brain. And so if you think about your brain and where your language is stored, I did a hesitation there because I really wanted to tell you about all the lovely sensory stuff that goes on in the brain, but the shortcut to the big detour that I was going to say is that your words are stored in different locations in your brain. So the funny one is that swearing is on the right-hand side of your brain, and day-to-day language is on the left-hand side of your brain, which is why when you stub your toe, you always go for a swear word, because the right-hand side of your brain is to do with motor responses. And when you stub your toe, it's a motor response to pull your foot back, and it's a motor response to shout a swear word. So you have different locations for different parts of your language in your brain. And I always imagine it, you know, like those grabby hand things that you get at the fair, where you have to control a thing and it picks up there's a mechanism in the brain that does that for your words. So when you want to use your words, there's a mechanism that's picking that up. And in people who are elixirthemic, the mechanism for retrieving the words to do with emotions is duff. It doesn't work properly, and you can't pick them up very well. And 10% of the general population experience elixirthemia, and 50% of the autistic population experience elixirthemia. So when people just say, oh, just talk about how you feel, if you like physically can't do that pickup, how can you do that? And then that gets muddled with interoceptive differences, which are huge within the autistic population. And it was really interesting because I saw Kelly Mailer, who's amazing on interoception, muddling this week. So elixirthemia is just it's that retrieval mechanism is either like working properly or not. Interoception is a sensory system that looks at how you're feeling. So it's a tricky one to explain because it is the sense that feels your feelings. So it's like when you have a feeling in your body, that feeling is made up of sensations that are internal to your body. And your interoceptive sense is the sense that looks at what those sensations are. So for example, if you were feeling nervous, like maybe you would experience like a churning in your stomach and your heartbeat fast. And the feeling of being nervous will produce that churning and will produce the strong heartbeat. You only feel that feeling, you only register that feeling if your interoception can look and tell you, my stomach is churning, my heartbeat is beating fast. And then that interoception will tell you that you're feeling nervous. And for most neurotypical people, making that distinction is really strange, because when you say to them, how do you feel? They just report it instantly, because it's like 20/20 vision in interoceptive land. They just feel it. But if you're sort of partially sighted to your own interoceptive, to your own internal landscape, you don't necessarily know how you're feeling. And so I can give you examples from my life. I did a really fantastic gig where I got to meet all these twinkly-eyed people who were all, wanting to change the world for profoundly disabled people. And I had such a fantastic day. And then I went home on the train and I got back to my partner's house, and he knows, he just makes me a salad and puts me on the sofa in front of the television in a little dark room. And as he tried to pass me the salad, I was doing this, and I realized that I couldn't grab the plate off him because my hands were holding onto my face. And so then so you think, oh, right, I've got to let go of my face. And I wasn't really aware up until I tried to grab the salad that I'd been holding my face. And so I took the salad with one hand and balanced it on my knee, and I went back to holding my face. And bless him, he waited for a bit. And then he looked at me, he said, okay, Jo, what are you doing? And I said, my face is too high up. And you know, if you've been smiling so much of a day that your face hurts, I'd got so that my face was hurting from smiling, but I hadn't realized I was happy. I hadn't noticed that that was an emotion. I was physically trying to hold my face back down. And that didn't help, you know. And they go, oh, I think I'm happy. And I don't know those things until they're really, really massive. And that means that my ability to change what I'm doing in response to my emotional landscape is impaired. So a lot of autistic people, you see their emotional landscape through their physical health. And that connection between physical and mental health used to be poo-pooed, and we've got much stronger evidence for the connection now. And so you'll see people with stomach problems or reoccurring infections or headaches or something like that. And if you're not able to adjust in response to the stress that you feel, because you don't necessarily, it's not that you're not feeling stressed, you are feeling stressed, it's just you're not feeling the feeling of stressed. It's that then you can't make those shifts, and that's going to affect your ability to maintain your emotional well-being. I said I was going to stop chatting to you after half an hour. I'm just going to do really quickly. I think you can probably, I can see people asking me questions already. Somebody's put something about CBT. Exactly. If your emotional processing difference is to do with the way your brain is wired, CBT is a process that gets you to register what your internal talk is and then to decide whether you want that to be your internal talk and reorganize it. That's not going to change a different way of processing emotions. So like one of the common things that people talk about within autistic emotional processing is shutdown or meltdown. And so those are responses to like a quantity of emotion. And I can speak more on shutdown because that's what I experience. But some of what I say about shutdown would like flip into a meltdown world. It's just the expression is different. So it's like running an old computer. So I'm old enough that when I did my essays for university, every so often the computer would just crash and you would lose all your work. And that used to be a really common thing in the land of computers and typing, and it doesn't happen anymore. But you'd just be working and it would just give up. It just couldn't handle what it was processing and it would crash and reboot. And I think it's a good parallel for autistic emotional processing compared to neurotypical emotional processing, because a neurotypical person hopefully will experience shutdown or meltdown like once or twice in life. You know, when something really massive happens, you hear people talk about it sometimes when they've experienced like a sudden death or, you know, a serious accident. And what they'll say is, I just felt numb. You know, I just felt numb. And what they're describing is that what they're saying is, I was in a situation that should have had loads of emotions because all this upsetting stuff has just happened, but I didn't feel any of those emotions. I just felt that, and the phrase that gets used is numb. But what they're describing is that they didn't feel anything when they knew that they were supposed to be feeling something. And what's happened is that the emotional load of that situation has been bigger than the emotional processing centers in their brain, and it's like made their little brain computer crash. And that will happen in an extreme situation. Whereas for me, my brain can handle a certain amount of emotion, and it doesn't have to be bad emotions. Not that there are such a thing as good and bad emotions. I'd get told off by people who know good stuff about mental health. But it's just a certain, like, it's not that I've been upset. I can have been happy and excited. I have a certain amount of emotion that I can process, and then my brain will just do a reboot. And so it shuts down and I don't feel anything. And then it will come, like, for me, it's like a day or two later, you sort of start to come back into an emotional world. Before I was diagnosed as autistic, that experience of shutdown was something that has put me at risk in different ways. So I was diagnosed as depressed in adolescence because I would be blank, you know, and I wouldn't be feeling affection or like I wouldn't be feeling the feelings that are supposed to be there in life. And you'd go to the doctor and you'd just say, I don't feel anything. And it sounds like a depressed person talking, like nothing in my life means anything to me anymore. I don't feel like passionate about the people that I love. It sounds like a depressed person. And so you get told you're depressed. And then being told that you're depressed makes you think of yourself as a depressed person, and they offer you treatments that are for depression, and you're led off down a path that isn't useful at all. Whereas if that doctor had said to me, it sounds a bit like autistic shutdown. Have you tried waiting a day or two to see if it goes away? It would have saved a lot of time and stress. It would have actually saved my first marriage, because I got married in my 20s to a totally lovely man, and I was in love with him and the world was wonderful. And then every so often I would just sit there on the sofa and I'd look at him and think, I don't feel anything for you. Like, something's gone wrong here. I don't feel anything. And I'd worry about it, and I'd worry about it for a couple of days, and then it would go away, and you think, oh no, it's okay, I'm in love with you, you're lovely, and we'd go back to being all young and in love, and then it would happen again, and you think, oh gosh. And I began to think that there was something, some dark secret at the heart of that marriage that I couldn't put my finger on, but something must be wrong. And so we got divorced. And I just remarried for a second time a few years ago, and I experienced shutdown probably a couple of times a month, and I'll sit there on the sofa and think, I don't feel anything for you. And then I think, the next couple of days are going to be the days to do the really boring work in, because if I'm not going to feel anything, I might as well do all that, my accounts and all the grotty, I'll do the tidying up, I'll do all the grotty stuff of life, and I'll probably love you again on Thursday. And it's like a nothing in my life now, but it was huge in the other direction. And I'm not supposed to be reading the questions, but I've just seen somebody ask, can we feel too much? Yes. So there is there's the nonsense that autistic people don't have an emotional life, which is one of those things where you read it in the research, you're like, how did you draw that as a conclusion? All you have accurately shown is that it's different. The response is different, the expression is different, and what would you expect from a different neurotype? You wouldn't expect it to produce the same emotional response. All you've shown is it's different. You haven't proved that it's not there. I found myself when I was writing the subtle spectrum, you write the bit about emotion, and then you're trying to justify, you're sort of trying to say, I am somebody who has feelings and an emotional landscape. And you think, in what other world would you ever have to go, oh no, I'm actually real, thank you. And I think I'm in a very privileged position of being able to use mouth words. Sorry if you can hear my dog. And for people who don't use mouth words, creating that defense is so much harder. I'm going to zip it so that people can ask me questions, but things that I had on my list that I didn't get a chance to talk about, in case you want to ask me questions about these, is the difference between autistic sleep and non-autistic sleep, because REM sleep affects emotional processing, our increased risk of trauma and why we have that increased risk to trauma, the higher incidences of self-harm and suicide ideation, and we are autistic people are at increased vulnerability of suicide, and of the different demographics within autism, it's women like me who are at most risk. So it's adult women who would be described as, they get described as high functioning, wouldn't I? Which is not a term we use. So yeah, things like that, self-harm, shutdown, meltdown. Sorry, I thought I would chat for 30 minutes and it would be easy, but it's 38 minutes. Right, so I'll zip it, and then people can ask me questions and I'll be talking about what you want me to be talking about, not just chatting to myself.
That's absolutely fine. And my dogs have escaped now and are in the room, so I do apologise if they make a noise. Okay, so I'll try and dig out the questions from the chat, and Vicky has helped me by sending me some. So the first one we're going to tackle is, I'm autistic and also teach autistic students in a SEN college. What would you suggest for supporting autistic young adults who are struggling emotionally and expressing this in unsafe ways?
Yeah, so I think it would be lovely to be able to point to the wealth of research that goes, this is great for autistic emotional processing, and we don't have it. But what you hear from the community is that people stim to relieve their stress, so promoting positive stimming, things that are to do with movement, so like walking and exercise. Lots of autistic people find that an active lifestyle like that is good for their emotional health. And then time to decompress. So a lot of autistic people really enjoy social contact, but need decompression time afterwards. And certainly if you're in a school setting, you are in a sort of social contact setting. And so if there could be a kind of burst pause to the rhythm of school life, so that there was decompression time almost modeled within it, I think that would be fantastic. And then you need alternative markers, because you mentioned expressing it in difficult ways. So I run a course that's called Exploring the Impact of the Senses on Behaviour, and a lot of this overlaps. But basically, if you have somebody who is expressing their emotional distress in a way that is difficult, like they're hitting somebody or biting themselves or throwing chairs, you would love to solve that emotional stress, and you should absolutely try and figure out what's causing it. But your first problem in that situation is that somebody else is getting hurt, or that they're hurting themselves. So if you can provide them with an alternative way of making that same expression, and so people try and do things like pointing at symbols to indicate that you're sad and things like that. Those will only work if they get responded to better than the first version. So I've supported people where when they're distressed, they'll punch somebody, and you say, right, next time you're distressed, come and show me the sad face card. When they punch somebody, everybody jumps up, everybody changes what they're doing, everything, everybody's on it. When they come up and show you the sad card, people go, oh, are you sad? Wait a minute, and I'll come and help you. If the sad card is going to work, it has to be a bigger response to that than the response that because otherwise you do that a few times and then you go, well, stuff this was what, this is a much more effective form of communication.
Okay, so another question. I would like to ask about chronic pain as a sensory processing difference rather than purely linked to stress. Is this something you've explored?
There's a link between how we feel pain when we're in different emotional states. So if you're if you're frightened and somebody pokes a needle in you, that will register as much more painful than if you're nice and chilled and relaxed and know it's going to happen. And so it's all these things muddling together, isn't it? A lot of autistic people have experienced trauma. And I don't mean by that we've had particularly spectacularly bad things happen to us, although we have had that as well. Trauma is a very specific thing in the brain. It's to do with how an event goes into your memory. And so two people can have had exactly the same experience, and one will be traumatized and the other won't. And it's to do with how that event goes into your memory. And the difference is how able you were to act in response to the event. And so what we find is, because our actions don't count, they're not valid, they're not responded to, they're not recognized, it's very easy for us to try and act in response to an event and not be able to. And so these events get stuck in our present. And so if you're living in a world of present stressful events, then your whole sort of system is heightened all the time, and that will make pain come through stronger. And then, yeah, if you've got sensory differences on top of that, such that you're registering those sensations differently, they'd be amplified. Again, it goes both ways. So I'm somebody who doesn't feel pain particularly significantly. And I remember working with a young man, because I've worked with children who would be described as having complex autism, or all the descriptions that we're not using, and he had gashed himself on his side and nobody noticed, because he didn't respond with a pain response. He didn't seem particularly stressed by it. He didn't notice his own pain because it wasn't registering that highly. So the sensory processing differences, it's that thing, it's that different to neurotypical brains and then different to our brains as well. It's an other type experience.
Okay, so I've got a question about alexithymia. Is this why autistic people are more likely to somatize stress, which can translate into functional symptoms, for example?
It would contribute. The elixirthemic bit is a very practical thing of just not being able to retrieve those words. So I've seen some really nice things done with people who've got a special interest, where they use their special interest and draw an analogy. So like if you have somebody with a special interest about cars, you say to them, if you were a car today, how would you be running? And they'd be like, oh, I really need to go for a service, or I'm full of petrol and ready to go. And you don't have to use any emotional words to say that, but it's really, really informative as to their emotional landscape. So there's very simple workarounds for the alexithymia problem. But I think most of what gets muddled up with that is the interoceptive problem. If you can't feel how your systems are running, then you need to be able to learn how to do that from an external point of view. And so my husband will tell me how I'm feeling, which I found really disorientating when he first moved in, because he would sort of come through my office and go, oh, you seem a bit stressed today. Like, am I? I felt quite put out by it because I was just busy working. I don't need to be told I'm stressed. But now if he sort of comes through 2 or 3 days running and goes, oh, you seem a bit, you think he's going on about that. Like, why would I be stressed? And you sort of start looking around, then you realize your to-do list is like 6 pages long. You go, oh, maybe that's it. I'll take a few things off there. And because I have that marker, I now make changes in my life. So to give you a really, to give you a nice measure for if you were doing some science, the year before my husband moved in with me, I had 12 emergency admissions to A&E units to receive very strong drugs for infections. I had a perfectly happy year as far as I was concerned. I was having fun. And since he's moved in and has told me what I'm feeling, I have had none, because I'm able to do those shifts. And it's a really odd thing, because you would never really presume to tell somebody how they're feeling because you think that they know it. It's really like presumptuous. But he obviously sees something in me. He's not feeling my feelings from the inside. He's picking up on external markers. So if he could teach me what those were, like if it was a young me, what I would want is for somebody to teach me what my markers are and then habituate me into recognizing them, just in the same way that I was taught to brush my teeth. Nobody wants to learn to brush their teeth. It's boring, but you get taught to make a habit out of it because it's good for you. And if somebody could habituate me, I'm too old and bloody minded now for it to work on me now. But if when I was young and slightly more malleable, somebody could have taught me, like, every time you go into the bathroom, look in the mirror and just see how your face, like if I'd looked in the mirror that day when I got to the end of the day and I was clawing my face back down, if I'd sort of consciously done a check in the bathroom mirror, I might have noticed, oh, I'm smiling. Or, notice how your body's moving. Is your body moving around a lot? Are you excited, or are you sort of really slumped and small? You put your hand on your forehead. Can you feel, are you frowning? You have to do it from the outside if you can't do it from the inside. And you won't want to do it because it won't feel relevant, because it's not an experience that you're having, but it's useful to get into the habit of doing it.
Right. I imagine a lot of people have found that very useful. So next question. I'm autistic and also got recently diagnosed with PTSD. I'm still struggling with the difference between a shutdown and disassociation. How do you see this difference?
Yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? Because it's a hard difference to describe, but a shutdown is you're sort of totally blank, whereas the disassociation is that disassociation from your body. You're not, it's more to do with your body. But it's a very tricky thing to look at mental health diagnoses unless they've been given by somebody who has a really good understanding of these differences. And like a lot of mental health practitioners are going to be brilliant at their jobs and know that the advice that they give is good, solid, grounded in research advice, but they're not necessarily going to recognize that that doesn't always apply across to autistic people. And so you might get diagnosed with a thing that is like the closest sounding neurotypical thing. That thing that I said about trauma earlier, I missed a bit. It's so the example that's a good one is after the Haiti earthquake. You remember when they had the earthquake in Haiti? After that earthquake went through and, you know, devastated all these villages and homes, so the people had a really horrific experience. They knew that it was going to trigger a tidal wave, so a tsunami was going to come in and be like their next big problem. And so they were airlifting people to safety, and the American military flew in with big choppers and they landed, and all these people who need to get, they've just had their homes wrecked, they've just seen people, they've just been through awful thing, ran and climbed on board these helicopters, were hauled up into the helicopters by the army guys and flown to safety. And as they flew the first wave of them out, they did like a head count of how many they'd got on board the chopper and how many there were still to rescue and how much time they had before that wave would hit. And they realized that if they kept getting that many, they wouldn't be able to get them all out in time. And so the next time they landed the choppers, instead of letting everybody climb on, they got off and they strapped the people to gurneys, and then they stacked them up the helicopter wall. And that way they were able to get way more people on board. And the two sets of people have both had the experience of having your home and your family and everything obliterated by this earthquake. They've both had a really horrific experience. But the ones that were strapped on the gurneys were traumatized, whereas the ones who were able to run and climb aboard the helicopter had a really bad experience. You know, I'm not, you know, an awful thing, but they were able to get over it and it became a memory in their past. Whereas the people who've been traumatized, it stays in your present. And it's that thing, we always know about it from like soldiers and the war, and a car backfires and they think they're being shot at, because in some way the war is still present. And the thing that makes the difference between whether it becomes a trauma and whether it becomes a memory is whether you were able to act against it. It was the action of the run. And a lot of the action that we need to do in life is a social communication that's based on a neurotype that's other to ours. So I have a lot of things that are present in my life all the time that are not, like, they're not earthquakes, they're just very minor. They're like conversations that I had at school that didn't quite right, or a teacher thinking something slightly different that wasn't what I meant. It's all these little muddly things, and they're not. I remember a boyfriend when I was younger getting fed up with me. He's like, it's like you're still at primary school in your head all day. You're like, I literally am, because I've been traumatized by all of those experiences. Because as a little autistic person who couldn't speak and couldn't say boo to Grace, it's really easy to traumatize us. And so the autistic population live with a lot of trauma, and then that feeds into all the other stuff like the mindfulness strategies and things like that. And just the assumption that your anxiety is it needs to be, quite often autistic anxiety is a sensory difference to do with your proprioceptive sense. And it's not, you know, it's not that you're overly worried about the world, where it's literally just that feeling of being anxious. And if you're heightened like that, then everything else, you respond differently to everything else.
Perhaps this might be a good time. I haven't seen that there's a question on this, and you've only just mentioned it, so it probably isn't. But perhaps this might be a good time to do a quick, you know, what can we do proprioceptively, if that's a word, to dampen down the anxiety a bit. Yeah, I know my daughter loves to go for a drive in the evening, for example.
Yeah,
has to go for a drive. Is on a drive at the moment, in fact.
Your proprioceptive sense is your awareness of where your body is in space. So quite often people have experienced not having proprioception just as they're waking up or falling asleep, and they feel like they're falling, and you get that kind of high like jump, and it's that sensation is what the world feels like without proprioception, and it's a very anxious sensation. And what's happening in that sense, in that situation, is that your proprioception is falling asleep slightly before you or waking up slightly after you, and just for a moment you've experienced the world without proprioception, and it's very anxious. And what you do is you reach to touch the bedclothes because your senses are going, I don't know where I am in space, quick, find out through a different sensory system. And so anything that tells you where your body is through another sensory system will counter that. And that experience of the falling asleep one is that's totally no proprioception, but all of your subconscious senses can process differently, can be impaired, just like your conscious senses can be impaired. So if you were sort of like the proprioceptive equivalent of partially sighted, then you would feel a bit like that all the time, just as your natural, registry of life. And so anything that you can do that orientates you to where you are. So there's lots of people talking about movement and exercise. You talked about movement in the car. Those are really good for informing you where you are in space. Simple things like having a window open and feeling a breeze across your skin tells you where you are in space. And then the things like compression wear clothing and being wrapped up or being under a weighted blanket, those are all like the weight of the blanket is going, here's where you are. Body brushing is a good one, and it's good for your skin and exfoliating, things like that. Just literally just like brushing down your body is very calming.
Okay, right. We are definitely not going to get through all the questions, but
there was a load of questions went past about sleep a minute ago.
I was just going to say we've had a lot of questions about sleep, so maybe 5 minutes on sleep, and then I promise that we will put together all of the questions from the chat and we'll pass them on to Jo, so that Jo, and perhaps we'll, I don't know, provide a document or something, and we'll put it in the YouTube. We'll put it with the YouTube video.
Well, I am also on a train for about 8 hours tomorrow. So if anybody wants to tweet me their question or Facebook message me their question, you'll be saving me from reading research that I really ought to be reading, but it won't be as interesting as your question. But to do the sleep one, when you're in REM sleep, that is part of that's part of the way the brain processes emotion. So you get all those weird dreams that are clearly bits of like parts of your day that have got muddled up, and it's your brain doing the filing system for where stuff goes. And autistic people have different amounts of REM sleep. It looks like we have less REM sleep than non-autistic people, but again, it's different to non-autistic people, and then it's different for us. It's the uniquely unique brain. So what we know for non-autistic people is that through the course of the afternoon, they experience a drop-off in dopamine. So from sort of like midday onwards, their dopamine levels will reduce, which creates a kind of natural wind down. You're cruising in to sleep, and then you get to the evening and you're sort of more relaxed and dopey and tired. And then around about, like you have a natural bedtime, that is the time that's your time to go to sleep. Just before whatever happens to be your particular natural bedtime, neurotypical people have a spike in melatonin, which is the hormone that it's not the hormone that makes you fall asleep, it's the hormone that starts the going to sleep process. So it initiates going to sleep. And when they look at autistic brains, what they find, and just to do that different generally, but you can very rarely generalize about us, is that we don't have a drop off in dopamine. So we stay on all day. We are as awake at 8 o'clock at night as we were at 8 o'clock in the morning, which professionally for me is very useful. It means I get a lot of work done in the afternoon. So the difference is not necessarily a deficit. It's capacity and context. It depends in what regard you're holding it. So we're on all the time, and then there was no melatonin spike. And so if you're somebody who has that melatonin spike, so if you're a neurotypical person and you experience that melatonin spike and you don't go to bed when that starting whistle on going to bed is signaled, you get what people refer to as their second wind, don't they? So long as you stay up past bedtime, then you kind of like revive and you can party all night, and then you only fall asleep when you're completely exhausted and you just sort of wipe out. And what I find with a lot of autistic children is because they don't have that melatonin spike that sets off the going to sleep process, a lot of them are just staying awake until they're absolutely exhausted, and then they conk out and fall asleep. And that's the only way that families can get them to go to sleep, is to wait until they're completely knackered. But like, if you've had that experience of doing that stay up partying, you know that that sleep is not as good as the proper night's sleep that, you know, started at bedtime and had everything in. So we get a kind of, if we're not going to bed until, if we're not falling asleep until we're wiped out, we're getting like a poor version of sleep. It's not as good a quality as if we'd had our full night's sleep. But in order to go to sleep, it's you have to like force the process, because there's no start gun. So for me as an adult, on a perfectly happy, lovely day when I'm not worried about anything and I haven't got a care in the world, I'll probably lie in, I go to bed at bedtime. I've got rules. I go to bed at bedtime, I lie in bed, I close my eyes, and I feel completely awake. And you're just like, right, now I must go to sleep. And it takes about an hour. And if you say that to a non-autistic person, they're like, God, my goodness, are you all right? Why is it, are you worrying? Are you upset about it? Like, no, that's just normal. If I was worried about something, that would take longer. And if I'm an adult and I'm reasonably sensible about sleep, I'm not sensible about my emotional processing, but I'm sensible about sleep because I've learned how dangerous it is to my mental health to not have enough sleep. So I'm quite strict about it and I'll force it, but it would be so much harder if I was a child, because it's like the brushing your teeth thing. Nobody wants to go to bed, do they? And you certainly don't want to go to bed if you don't feel tired.
No, I mean, going to bed is a transition, and it's a change. If you're a child, it's, well, whether you're a child or an adult, it's taking you away from the fun things that you were doing, and your attention tunnel, if we're talking about monotropism, you know, it's taking them away from that. So it's not going to be a fun thing, is it, going to bed?
No.
And making bed too fun a place will probably mean that you didn't sleep either. So yeah, that's difficult. So people are asking, are there things that you can do, especially to help children go to sleep? Because obviously children need more sleep than adults, and you have to try and get them to school.
It's in my professional life, I've worked with people with autism, learning disabilities, who get described as very severe. And when I was a foster carer, I fostered autistic children who were complex and nonverbal and things like this. And it is the only time I would recommend a drug. The giving of melatonin to replace a hormone that we're not naturally producing, that other people naturally produce, seems like a very you still have to do all of the sleep hygiene around bedtime. It's not, melatonin is not a sleeping tablet. It's not going to make them go to sleep, but at least you give the starting pistol. And so it's one of the ones that I would consider. All the rest of it is just like a bigger version. You know, you talk about sleep hygiene with typical children, where you have a bedtime routine, you have a bath, and you switch off the digital stuff, and you have a routine that you follow. If you're trying to support an autistic person to do that forced sleep process, it's like you need that, but on steroids. You need all the blue light producing things switched off, and that's a hard one, because a lot of autistic people rely on tablets and televisions and things like that to provide the to sort of slow their brains down, to distract you from all the busy things in your heads. So there's a study that found autistic brains at rest produce 42% more information than neurotypical brains at rest. So it's a really noisy brain that you're living with. And if you can just sort of default it to a TV program or a repetitive computer game, I totally get why you would do that. But obviously those blue light things are stimulating and keep you awake. So maybe you put the anti-blue light stuff on, the shades or the filters, and do the movement so your body is tired, and eat the right things, and all the general stuff, just in spades.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's 3 minutes past 9, and I'd promised you that we would not continue.
Really
past this
tempting to
point.
keep talking, but I have got to pack to get on the train. Otherwise, it's going to look
I think
really bad.
we need to
on Friday.
facilitate you getting on that train tomorrow. So
Thank
we
you.
are going to leave it there, and I'm really sorry for everyone whose question we haven't answered. If it's any consolation, you're not alone. So that will be okay.
I've totally just I've put my links to my social media, so I'm there on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn all of the time. You're welcome to send me a message tomorrow. I will just be sat on a train, so I'd love to hear from you all. But thanks for listening.
And we'll collate all of the messages in the chat, and then we'll pass them on to you.
Okay, cool.
So thanks everyone for coming tonight, and thank you, Jo. I hope you have a good 10 hours on a train tomorrow, or however
it's
long
not too long
to
tomorrow, it's just a few, but yeah.
And thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you again soon. Good night.